This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Luke Burgis. Luke is an entrepreneur in residence and the director of programs at the Sioka Center for Principled Entrepreneurship at the Catholic University of America's Business School in Washington, D.C. So Luke has a very interesting background. After a brief career in investment banking and private equity, he moved to Silicon Valley and became an entrepreneur. He started his first company at the age of 23, and he was named a top 25 entrepreneur under 25 by Businessweek. He's the founder of several startups, including one called FitFuel that was recognized as having an outstanding company culture. And this is an area that Luke has been thinking about for a long time. And during this period, he formed a close partnership with Zappos and the late Tony Hsieh. After a number of years in Silicon Valley, he left the world of business and entered seminary to discern whether he had a vocation to the priesthood. So he spent several years in the United States and in Rome studying philosophy and theology. And after a time decided this was not his vocation, he came back to the U.S. and went back to the business world. So now, combining his business experience and academic training, he is the entrepreneur in residence at the Catholic University's Business School and also the managing partner of Fourth Wall Ventures, which is an incubator that he found to build, train, and invest in people and companies. Luke is also a writer. He's the co-author of the book Unrepeatable, Cultivating the Unique Calling of Every Person. And he's just finished a new book called Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life, where he applies the insights of Rene Girard into commerce, business, and economics. And this book will be released in the spring of 2021 from St. Martin's Press. It's already got a lot of really good reviews. You can learn more about the book and Luke at lukeburgis.com and sign up and pre-order the book. And also you can follow him on Twitter at Luke Burgis. So we did this interview early in the year while he was in the midst of writing it. So it was interesting to have this discussion with him as he's working through the ideas. And hopefully we'll have him back next year after the book comes out so we can discuss it in more detail. So thanks again for listening to the podcast. Appreciate all those who've written reviews, and I've gotten a number of nice, encouraging notes from people. So I'm glad you're finding the podcast worthwhile. Again, if there's anything that you'd like me to discuss, if there's maybe a certain thinker or writer or an idea that you think would be helpful to discuss, please feel free to send me an email. You can reach me at michael@michaelmathesonmiller.com or put comments at themoralimagination.com in the comment section. Again, all the show notes, everything that we discuss from this show and all the others can be found at themoralimagination.com, where I put links to Luke's book and his website and all the other things, and at Catholic University of America. So please visit The Moral Imagination. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoy my interview with Luke Burgis on his new book, Wanting and the Economy of Desire. Thanks, Luke, for coming on the podcast.
Good to be on the show. And I think that you are actually the reason why I'm at the Sioka Center for Principled Entrepreneurship, if I remember right. You told me about Andreas Widmer, and I think are the person that put us in touch. So thanks for that.
Oh, well, if that's the case, you're welcome. I wasn't sure if I put you in touch or he put us in touch. But anyway, I'm glad you're there.
Andreas and I debate this, and the story is a little bit fuzzy, but I think it was you. Anyways.
Listen, whatever gives me the most credit, that's the story I'm going with.
That's right. We'll go with that one then. So I am at Catholic University now as entrepreneur in residence, which is a title that doesn't mean a whole lot other than I'm an entrepreneur by trade. For 10 years of my life after college, left the world of investment banking when I was 23 and moved to California, started a few different companies while I was in my 20s, stepped away from it when I was in my late 20s, entered seminary formation, studied philosophy for a number of years. They sent me to Rome to study theology for a few years. And I eventually left seminary formation, realized I was not called to be a priest, and came back to the States, got re-involved in the startup world as an entrepreneur, but now with certainly, you could probably say with an expanded moral imagination of what my vocation as an entrepreneur was, and really wanting to integrate sort of my understanding of anthropology and the spiritual life with the work that I do in entrepreneurship and starting companies. So Catholic University was a great fit for me. You know, we sort of approach business and approach entrepreneurship with the human person at the center of everything. So the idea is if you don't understand who the human person is, you really can't offer goods that are truly good and services that truly serve. So I do a lot of writing. I teach at the business school. I'm working on a lot of projects. Some of them I can talk about. One of them is introducing entrepreneurship curriculum in the Catholic school system across the country, and a lot of other projects. But right now, one of the big ones is writing this book, which I'm really excited about, on the thought of Rene Girard, specifically, though, thinking about the impact that he might have on business and economics in that sphere of the world, which he didn't talk a lot about. So I'm sort of trying to take Rene Girard's thought and apply him to this area of life.
Let's do a little review of kind of Girard's key ideas and then focus on the ones, especially that we talked about with desire. Again, the name of your book is Wanting, Our Secret Economy of Desire, and imitation, and how this plays out in business and commerce, and especially your area of focus. So why don't you start with just a quick review of the mimetic cycle of Girard and why you think it matters?
Sure. So the mimetic cycle of Girard, I want to be careful about going through the whole cycle too fast, because Girard has sort of an understanding of the human person and the way that our desires have shaped all of human history. But it happened very slowly. So if I move through the 4 cycles in 5 minutes, it's going to sound a bit reductionistic. So I want to sort of move through this without naming them all or going through them too quickly. But it all starts with his insight into the role of imitation in human desire. So I think it's important just to talk about what do we mean by the word desire in the first place. So desire is a relatively vague word, but Girard uses it in a very particular way. So one way to think of it is, what do we want after we've satisfied our basic needs? So we can differentiate between needs and wants. So needs, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom level would be physiological needs. And then you've got safety needs. But after a human being has satisfied all of these basic needs, he sort of looks up into this universe of desire, which is basically infinite. And for the needs, we sort of have built-in homing mechanisms, biological needs for food and drink and sex and warmth. So those are sort of built into our very person. But when it comes to desire, it's after we've left the world of needs, where we have some mechanisms to help understand what it is that we need. Desire is different. And Girard says, left sort of in this world of desire, what we look to help us understand what to want is primarily other people. So desire, in its very essence, is social. And it's very different than the way that most of us think of desire. It's sort of what Girard calls the romantic lie, that I sort of create desires out of nowhere, ex nihilo. I create them, or I am the sole independent judge of what's wantable. And I want what I want because, I've objectively valued it as desirable. Girard says that that's a romantic lie, and that in fact, desire is derived from this sort of relational context of the human person. So desire is after we've satisfied our needs. Desire is differentiated from needs in that way. It's what we do next. So as we're looking out into the world and to other people to understand what it is that is wantable, we run into a problem, because fundamentally we're imitating the desires of other people. We're looking to other people to help us understand what we should want. And this, if we don't realize that we're doing it, de facto draws us into a type of rivalry with them. So if I'm looking to somebody else to give me a cue of value or whether or not I should want something, I become their rival and competing with them for the same good, if that good is scarce.
Okay, that's good. So let me just ask 2 questions off this. One is, where does the original desire come from? I mean, if we're all imitating other people, don't some people have unique original desires that become the basis of imitation? I mean, are there not some unique, unrepeatable persons who want something, and it doesn't always have to be desire? How does he deal with that?
Before I answer that question, I want to go back to a very fundamental thing in Girard, and that's the role of imitation. And I think I'll get to what Girard would say to that question. But let's start by just looking at a child. I think this is very helpful to think about when a child comes into the world and a baby is born, there's been studies that have been done. Dr. Andrew Meltzoff at the University of Washington is most, I think, regarded of early childhood development studies. He showed that within minutes of birth, a baby can mimic facial gestures and is already imitating the mother. And it doesn't take very long until the baby can imitate the gaze, can do what's called gaze following of the mother. So can look at the mother's eyes and see that the eyes are looking at some object. So at this point, so imitation is something that we do right away from the minute that we're born. And the baby is imitating the mother from day one. The mother is basically the baby's whole world, right? So an interesting step happens, though, when the baby realizes that the mother's gaze is looking at an object. So it goes from just looking at the eyes and seeing the eyes and imitating the movement of the eyes to seeing the thing that the mother is looking at, and then realizing that that object has some value because the mother is looking at it. So the mother is what Girard would call the baby's sole model of desire in the earliest stages of life. And then, of course, the father. I mean, the parents are the first models of desire. They're the social context that shapes and forms desire at the beginning of life. The question of where does desire come from in the first place, and does anybody sort of have any desires of their own? I don't think there's any Girardian orthodoxy here. It's very important. So in this book, I mean, I break with Girard on a couple of things. Girardians would basically say the answer is no. The answer is flat out no. And if you think about just human life in general, I mean, from a theological standpoint, we exist because we were desired first, right? By God, through the desires of our parents, through the very acts that brought us into being as co-creators. And then in that baby's development, that desire, we could say that desire is sort of been implanted. I mean, certainly a desire for the fullness of life, the desire for God. But even then, that desire in this life, in this world, as an incarnate creature, is always mediated by other people, starting with the parents. And then, when the child begins to be 12 or 13 and realizes that their parents are not gods and might even hate their parents, they start looking for other models. Those models might be their friends, but always mediated. So even the very desire for God himself is mediated through structures or people in this world. It could be the church, it could be priests, parents, friends. So desire is mediated in this life, even though we're born with a telos. There's a teleology of desire implanted in us because we have an end for which we were created. It's still always mediated by others.
Okay, so real quick, you say we have a telos. So that we have this teleological direction, so implanted in us. So Girard, in a sense, does Girard kind of align with, say, Aristotle, classical philosophy, St. Thomas Aquinas, that we have a nature, an essence, that has a purpose and a direction. And part of that essential structure is that we desire, right? So like you could say, maybe this is a nuance, but so the first principle of practical reason, right, for St. Thomas, is that good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. So you're already teleologically directed towards the good, right? You want things. How does Girard overlap with that understanding of teleology? Is that implied? Is he specific? Does he give his own articulation of this kind of what you call Aristotelian, Thomistic, classical understanding of teleology?
Girard does not get into philosophy and theology that deeply. Very, very few places where you can find him. I don't know if I can recall any place where I can recall him quoting Thomas Aquinas, for instance. So Girard was not a philosopher. I don't think that his Girardian thought is not a philosophy. It's not an anthropology. It's not some kind of product of the Enlightenment where he had this insight into things. It's fundamentally revelation. And I think Girard himself would say that he didn't discover anything on his own. It's already sort of all in the Gospels in a way. And he's sort of pointing out what's already there and then drawing out some of the implications of that. I think my opinion is that he does square with that understanding of the human person and this creative freedom that we have, that it's very important for us to choose our models wisely, our models of desire. So realizing that we're not these completely autonomous, independent sort of creatures. The relationships that we have do form much of what we want. We need to be very intentional about the kinds of relationships that we enter into, and the way that we live and move within those relationships, knowing that it's not I think that could be interpreted in sort of a deterministic way.
That seems to be actually what I was thinking as well, right? And there's a sense in Girard that we are deeply influenced by our desires, by imitation. And in one sense, it has a deterministic element to it, just like our biology has our neurological structures, our genes, our epigenetics. We are clearly influenced by our environment and our physiology. And we're influenced by desires. But for Girard, there also seems to be that sense of freedom, right? Which is, again, part of kind of Aristotelian, Bonaventure, Thomas. I mean, this is kind of part of the classical understanding of the back and forth between being deeply shaped by something and having freedom. So, first of all, correct that understanding. If Girard seems to have that overlap, it also seems that becoming aware that our desire is important, as you noted earlier, is also an important part of our movement towards freedom in Girard. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely right. So there is that. We've got to do some sort of divergent thinking here and be able to hold these two sort of ideas. This is a classic both and scenario, one in each hand. I think there's a certain level of humility involved that, if I think the world's going wacky and haywire and, its desires are all complex and conflicted, doesn't know right from left anymore, that I can somehow just escape that by locking myself in my room, sort of like Buddha, right? And, achieving some kind of independent enlightenment where I no longer, have any of the desires of the world anymore. I sort of totally detach myself from that and achieve this sort of state of desire that has nothing to do with the world. Well, that's certainly not the Christian understanding of desire or the human person. So that would be really an illusion if I think that I can do that. And it takes a certain amount of humility to realize that I can't create or shape my desires on my own, and that I need other people, and certainly I need God and God's grace, if we're going to talk theologically, in order to do that.
So for Girard, then, the critique of, say, a certain type of radical detachment, whether it's, you gave the example of Buddhism, but whatever it might be, is not actually possible. It doesn't match the constitutive nature or essential structure of our being, in which desire is a fundamental element. So you can't escape the fact that you have imitative desire for Girard. So the way you, in a sense, detach yourself from it is to become more cognitively aware of it. Is that right?
I think that's right. And there's this funny phenomenon that sometimes the more people like to think that they're independent and rejecting the sort of the dominant culture and narrative, the more they end up imitating it or becoming it. It would be better to say that they become a mere image of the very thing that they want to reject. It's kind of like why all hipsters look alike, right? It's what Girard would call negative mimesis. He's got a great quote, something to the effect of, in leaving the pathway, everybody sort of falls into the same ditch. There's almost a rivalrous relationship with desire that has just a false understanding of kind of the subject-object relationship and relationships between other human beings. It's an illusion of detachment that we can't actually achieve.
So I think that this is good. That's a good segue to move, because one of the questions, I want to go into desire a little bit more, but so we don't go down maybe a rabbit trail of this. And one of the questions is, why is this idea of imitation and desire so important? And I think you began to touch upon it, because it really does shape the way we live and make decisions. And getting some awareness of it, even if we don't always control it, at least begins to kind of take us to a position where we mature, right? That we begin to understand, okay, why am I acting this way? How are my desires going out? And I think the example of, everybody leaves the pathway, you fall into the same ditch. That seems to be, I think, an ancient problem, but even more so a modern problem where you have mass media and communication. Jacques Ellul wrote a very interesting book on propaganda, and in his book also on technological society, where he talks about, there's always propaganda, but propaganda is heightened in this kind of technological society where there's lots of immediate communication. And Jared Lanier talks about this in his 10 arguments to delete your social media accounts, where there's a lot of behavior modification going on. So that, in a sense, sometimes people think they're rebelling against, say, a classical position, but they end up they've just been propagandized and their desires have been molded and they're unaware of it. I mean, that seems to me one of the reasons why Girard is pretty important today, because it helps us at least begin to navigate these complex waters of propaganda, desire, imitation, and then what it means to lead a good life.
Right. And there's a reason why Girard used the word mimesis and he didn't use the word imitation. I think it's important to understand why. So imitation, he said, is far more pervasive than anybody realized. I mean, Aristotle and Plato recognized the role of imitation in culture and society. So we've known about imitation for a long time, but it was always imitating art, imitating language. We learn by imitation. So we've known that imitation is important. What sort of Girard's insight was is that imitation is far, far more fundamental and pervasive than we realize, and goes all the way down to our very desires. And we talked a little bit earlier about babies imitating the mother and following the gaze and facial gestures. But as an adult, we imitate differently than a baby does. We imitate in this very, very sophisticated adult way of imitation that oftentimes, because we're embarrassed or proud, we don't want to admit that we imitate. Children have no problem imitating. They're like proud to imitate. Children in school, they want to imitate the teacher. They want to imitate. As adults, we're embarrassed to imitate. And so it goes underground. We hide it. We disguise our imitation. It goes under a lot of different masks. And that's what Girard calls mimesis. So
what would be an example of that? What would be an example of that it goes underground? Could you explain that a little bit?
Goes underground. And a classic example of this is The Underground Man from Dostoevsky. Girard, talks about that book quite a bit as an example of underground sort of repressed desire. It would be, I'm trying to give an example that people might be able to relate to, in the workplace, for instance, and this can happen at the company level or just within a workplace, people competing for the same jobs. There are usually people that are models within the workplace, and other people sort of compete fiercely with them as their rival, sort of doing let's say there's somebody who's in a higher position than you are in the company. Sort of, you want to imitate them because clearly they're doing something right to have achieved that status. So we do want to imitate them, but it's not the kind of thing that we go around telling people about. Like, we're not proud of the fact that we imitate other people. So we disguise it, and we use all kinds of euphemisms to describe kind of why we want to do the things that we do without really being honest about it. And sometimes it manifests itself as doing the opposite of what somebody that we secretly really admire is doing. And we have this deep need to be different and to not be the same as other people, or to think that we're the same as other people. So even while we could admire them and they could be a model of desire for us, we try to find ways to differentiate ourselves. And whatever they do, we do something different. It's kind of like a classic case of like kids. Like, so, you wear this sweater, I wear this sweater. I'll never wear the same one as you. Well, the kid that is doing that, that's actually a model for him. And it's because he wants to wear a black sweater that he'll never wear a black sweater. He's going to wear a white sweater. It's this weird form of imitation where the imitation is strong, but there's not an acknowledgement that other person is actually driving our behavior, and we won't admit it.
So how does this then in your book, Wanting, I know you're still working on it, but in our secret economy of desire, how do these Girardian insights about imitation and desire play out?
Well, desire in mimesis starts out as what Girard would call acquisitive. So two people are competing for the same object. It could be the same status at a job, the same position at a job. We all know that high school students compete fiercely to get into the same colleges. to go into the same MBA programs, to get the same jobs after school. This is really acquisitive mimesis. We're competing for the same things, the same objects. Girard says if this goes far enough and we don't realize that it's happening, that acquisitive imitation and desire for objects turns into what Girard calls metaphysical desire. And metaphysical desire is the desire to actually be the other person that is a model for us, the other person that we're imitating. Envy would be sort of the classic vice associated with this metaphysical desire. Envy really is deep down an extreme dissatisfaction with oneself, and we would prefer to sort of be another person. So metaphysical desire is a nasty thing. It's actually a denial of one's own sort of being and personhood. And that's a spiritual problem, of course, but it also leads to all kinds of cultural problems, sort of an inability to accept differences, period. So we have a flattening of our world right now, where we seem to want to eliminate all differences. And the more that we eliminate differences, the more everybody is the same, the more everybody takes everybody else as a model. And that, in Girard's view, is very dangerous. Girard says that conflict and violence doesn't come from our differences. It comes from our sameness. It comes because we're the same. He talks about mythology, where every culture in the world has some myth where they're identical twins or twins that end up killing each other. I said, why is that? Well, that is a representation of what these cultures have always known. And that's that sameness leads to a fierce desire to differentiate ourselves, and eventually draws us into conflict. So I think this is something that's very, very relevant for our world today when it comes to class warfare. Social media has completely sort of flattened the topography of desire, if you will, which
how do you
could
think
be a
that,
dangerous thing.
For example?
Let's take Facebook. So when we talk about models or mediators of desire, Girard says there are two kinds. There are external mediators of desire. So an external mediator is somebody who's not in our world. It could be a celebrity, somebody that is dead. So, a famous writer could be an external mediator for me. I want to imitate Nabokov because he's a beautiful writer, but there's no worry about me coming into competition with him at all. An internal mediator is somebody who's in our world, in our class, in our company, in our social sphere, that we can come into contact with and compete directly with. So what social media has done, it's taken what used to be external mediators. And the world, we didn't have such, we couldn't, 15-year-old girl in the United States couldn't know what every 15-year-old girl all over the world is doing and wanting at every hour of the day. So now the world of external mediation has really disappeared. It's disappearing very, very quickly. And everybody is now an internal mediator. So it's almost like social media has turned the entire world into a high school freshman classroom where we know what everybody else is wanting at all times.
Mm-hmm. So that's very helpful, actually. That's, I think, a good insight. But so keep going then. So you have this problem of uniformity. Or let me say this. It's kind of interesting. Two ideas come to mind when you talk about this, and the idea especially of envy. So when you have, and correct me if I've misunderstood this, when you have this broadening of internal mediation, where you're now, in a sense, in competition with everybody else, it increases the chance for envy. Because, and I like the definition, envy is a deep dissatisfaction with oneself, right? So in a sense, jealousy, you think, I see what someone wants, and I'm going to try to get it. But envy is you want that person destroyed, but the reason you want that person destroyed is generally because you're dissatisfied with yourself. And so two writers that come to mind one is Max Shaler, who in his book Ressentiment deals with this question of deep-seated ressentiment, which is different from resentment. That's why he uses the French word, but that is more like sour grapes. The famous, Aesop's fable of the fox who wants to get the grapes. He's trying to get them. He can't get them. Instead of saying, those would have been delicious grapes, and next time I'll try to get them and I'll work harder, he instead says, the grapes weren't good anyway. They were sour. And so this sour grapes ends up being a transvaluation where the good becomes low and the low thing becomes high and the good that you seek after. And that it becomes a very destructive force, this ressentiment. It seems that there's an overlap between kind of Shaler's notion of ressentiment and in many ways the way we get there, Girard seems to articulate. So the other thinker that I thought about, which I talk about a lot, is Alexis de Tocqueville. And Tocqueville worries that in democratic society with increasing individualism and equality or egalitarianism, that instead of looking up to a model, for example, we're always looking to the side. We're always looking to the side. And that, in fact...
Also for a model.
Right, exactly. No, we're looking to the side for a model. Exactly. No, thank you for that. And that actually Tocqueville makes a very interesting point regarding to religion, which is a little bit off topic, but I think at least can shed some light on this, that he predicts that one of the dominant religions in democratic life would be pantheism, because equality would drive us so far that we wouldn't even want God above us, right? There'd be envy, in a sense, about God, and that we would look back to the side. And so there'd be this kind of pantheistic element. But these kind of Tocquevillian ideas and Girard, the idea that sameness increases creates the conditions for what Shaler calls ressentiment, but it also creates, if I understand Girard correctly, the conditions for violence, right? For contagion and violence, because sameness is the real driver, right? This competition among sameness. Am I getting that right? And B, if so, could you expand on it a bit?
Sure. Let me start with the sour grapes, because the sour grapes is something that our friend Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks a bit about. And I like Taleb a lot. He wrote a great book called Anti-Fragile and another book called Skin in the Game.
My favorite is Anti-Fragile.
That's his best.
I like Fooled by Randomness, but I think Anti-Fragile is definitely his best book. I mean, Taleb is great. I mean, he can be a little bit,
magnum opus.
Yeah, no, it's great.
A little rough around the edges.
Yeah, and sometimes I think he doesn't totally understand teleology.
Aquinas.
And Aquinas. So he makes errors there. Yeah. But I just think he really, I mean, I remember I sometimes when I read books, I get cranky if they're really good and they're challenging me and kind of making me question certain things. And so Taleb's he made me so cranky. I mean, I enjoyed it. I read it. I've it all earmarked and everything. But definitely, he made me cranky. So I like Taleb. And if you haven't read Taleb, if any of the listeners haven't read Taleb, Anti-Fragile, I think it's the best way to go. Luke, you agree?
Yeah. Well, if my book is half as entertaining as Anti-Fragile, then I would have done a good thing. Hopefully I'll say some true stuff too. But Taleb talks about the sour grapes, and that's why I brought him up. And he says something along the lines of the best part about being rich, and Taleb is now rich. I mean, not only because of his books, but because he's a good trader as well. Mm-hmm. He goes, the best part about being rich is that you can despise rich people without any fear of sour grapes. There's a typical, very sort of Talebian language. Taleb sort of very notoriously just thinks that a lot of rich people are kind of frauds and fakes. And the best thing about being rich is that you can despise them. You don't have to worry about sour grapes. He's saying, because I'm rich myself, so I don't have to worry about my only not liking rich people because I secretly wish that I was rich myself. This is a very, very interesting kind of Girardian thing that he's saying. I think that's dangerous because it implies that you need to fight to get to the top first, so then you can sort of think and do whatever you want. And for most people, that's a real recipe for disaster. Mm-hmm. And I posed the question about the tale of the sour grapes, by the way. I think that the reason why it was so easy for the fox to call the grapes sour, to do this sort of transvaluation, is because he was alone. There wasn't another fox there. If there was another fox there who thought that the grapes were good, would it have been so easy for him to call the grapes sour and walk away? There have been 5 other foxes there who were all, watering at the mouth for the grapes. Would he have been able to do that? I think probably not.
Unless they all couldn't get it. What if they all couldn't
Unless they all couldn't get it. And then as a mob, they collectively turned on the grapes. But there's a mimetic component here. And I think that it's interesting that the fox was alone because it changes the dynamic of desire. There had been a group of foxes that things would have happened, maybe would have happened a little bit differently. That's a thought experiment that I've done. as I've been writing the book. Let's see. Your second question was Tocqueville, and this idea of sort of envy in a democratic society. He was commenting on early America.
Yeah, Tocqueville just says, that individualism and equality are some of the driving forces of democratic life, and that what happens is, as equality gets more and more influential, which he said then and predicted, that people would no longer look up and they are only looking to the side. And if that's true, which I think it is, and then you combine Tocqueville and Girard, now you have the recipe, a democratic recipe, and with social media, like you talked about, where you have all these internal mediators, and this creates sameness and now conditions for violence and scapegoating. Do you think that's right?
I think that's right. I would. I've heard some people comment on the founding fathers. I think Michael Novak talks a little bit about this, and he said that the founding fathers were actually researching why other republics and civilizations failed. And as they looked into it, they realized that usually it was class warfare. There was the priestly class, there was the aristocrats, and the different class. Eventually, it ends up destroying the society. So that they were very intentional. So they realized that envy was what could potentially undo the United States of America, and they took intentional steps to try to prevent that from happening. And they sort of formed this commercial republic where everybody was mobile, and that was an intentional. It had never been done before. It's this idea of the commercial republic, where these competing interests battle it out, and nobody would ever. So these factions are a good thing. And Michael Novak actually suggests that in the early days of our country, people weren't as envious as they are today. And somebody would look at their neighbor's prosperity and think, "Wow, this is a good thing. Let's celebrate it because this is a sign of, our town's coming prosperity," or something like that. I think Aquinas defines envy as sorrow at another person's good. Mm-hmm. And, I think Novak says something to the effect like, well, they didn't have sorrow. They actually had joy over the other person's good. They would celebrate it because they sort of viewed themselves as collective. And sort of he implies that envy has grown, and we sort of have a more envious country than we had before. I'm a little leery of saying that some vice is more prevalent now than it used to be. I think we're sort of projecting a lot of stuff on history. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily true. But it does seem that as everything becomes flattened and we have this push for sameness in almost every area of life, and we got Common Core, and we could talk about this in education and sexuality and so many different areas. It does seem that the tension is building, and we may be reaching some form of Girardian sort of tipping point.
Right. So for all our talk of diversity, there's actually a love of uniformity and a fear of actual difference, I think, is part of the democratic challenge that we're in. So, okay, so let's go off that for a second, though. I think that's very interesting. And let's talk a little bit about how one of the things Girard addresses is this problem of contagion, right? And so your book obviously is Wanting. There's our secret economy of desire. And one of the things that happens with desire is that desire becomes contagious. And that's right. I mean, it's at the center, of course, as you mentioned, of Girardian idea that there's already rivalry going on. But why don't you talk a little bit about how we go into the problem of contagion? And the thing I think that's so interesting about Girard is that contagion isn't just one thing. Contagion manifests itself in multiple ways. Let's talk about contagion, and then maybe if we have time, you can get to the problem of scapegoating, how contagion and desire and rivalry leads to scapegoating.
Yeah. So contagion, the word itself implies some form of contact with others. I mean, it's traditionally been used in the context of medicine and contagious disease. So we're talking about contact with other people. Girard uses the word contagion in the context of desire, the contagion of desire. So in a community, let's just imagine a small community of people, call it 20 or 30 people, could be a classroom. The desire because this is what we call the world of internal mediation. There are no external models of desire. Everybody's can be potentially a model for everybody else. In the world of external mediation, there's really not a huge threat of contagion because there's kind of a barrier between the subject and his or her model, right? But in the world of internal mediation, desires can spread very, very easily. So we have, there's the classic example of that Girard uses of, the kid, the toddler that goes into a room full of toys with 20 of her friends for a birthday party, and they're all kind of playing with toys. And she goes and she grabs the cool red truck over in the corner of the room, which nobody thought was cool before she went over and found it. And she takes it into the middle of the room and starts playing with it. And all of a sudden, one other boy sees the cute girl with the nice bows in her hair playing with the red truck. And all of a sudden, he takes an interest in it. And now he's in the center of the room, and now they're fighting over the truck. And that battle over that object signals to everybody else in the room that this thing is worth fighting over, or that it's an object of desire worth paying attention to. So there's no way that that's going to remain just the two of them. For sure, another little boy is going to come and fight with that little boy over the truck. And then pretty soon they might forget about the truck in the first place and just start fighting because they couldn't even remember what they were fighting over. Another little girl will join and they'll all start fighting until some adult walks in the room and breaks it up. I mean, even children do this. And as this contagion of desire over spreads and people start taking cues from other people and getting involved, it's really hard to sort of resist the pull of sort of entering the fight. It's kind of like, politics in our country right now. It's really hard to stand on the sideline when this kind of rivalry is happening. So people get pulled in, sometimes almost as if it's against their will. And when this happens long enough, it begins to escalate. Everybody sort of is one-upping everybody else. It's the funny thing about violence is that, if you punch me in my shoulder, I sort of instinctively want to punch you back just a little bit harder. And then we keep going like that. It's not kind of a one-to-one imitation. There's kind of, it's exponential. So this is what happens in a community when this mimetic rivalry is taking hold. Sooner or later, the objects that started the whole thing, whether it was the red truck or a policy decision or, something in a company, the objects disappear and the people forget about them and they just start to war with each other and they just keep finding new things. I mean, the objects are dispensed with. They could find a new thing every single day that gives them a reason to be fighting with the rival. And when this happens in a community, it leads to all-out chaos because people can swap out models. Today, it's this person's the problem. Tomorrow, this person's the problem. It's kind of a Hobbesian war of all against all. And nobody even knows how it started eventually. And that's where the real danger lies, when sort of there's this mimetic web of very tangled desire that needs to somehow get untangled.
Romeo and Juliet, of course, is an example of this, right?
Absolutely.
So that you have, in a sense, like there's always a new thing, but these families are constantly fighting. No one probably remembers exactly where the original rivalry came from. So let me ask a couple of questions. We don't have that much time left, so I'd like you to do at least talk a little bit about the scapegoating mechanism, because the scapegoating mechanism is important, and it's one of the reasons why Girard is important, is that he explains how scapegoating takes place. And of course, he has his book called The Scapegoat. He talks about it in Violence and the Sacred, and in I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning. Again, if you don't know much about Girard, I recommend you start with I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, and then move into The Scapegoat and Violence and the Sacred. But explain the concept of scapegoating and how this all works out. And of course, I talked about this with Greg Thornberry on the podcast. Listeners, if you're interested in hearing again, I recommend the Greg Thornberry podcast. I think it's episode 4. And you can go through that and this kind of in about 45 minutes kind of breaks down in very introductory form the Girardian kind of framework. But Luke, maybe you could talk a little bit about scapegoating and what happens and why this is a problem, why all these things actually matter, because sometimes people or groups get scapegoated.
Mm-hmm. So in this mimetic crisis, it leads to sameness. When everybody is fighting over the pettiest things, the objects have long since disappeared, everybody kind of starts looking the same when it comes to their desires. The desires are flattened out. You could say that everybody starts looking like an idiot. It's kind of that old saying, right? Like if you fight or argue with an idiot, you just kind of become one too. I think that's the same situation in a mimetic crisis, whether it's in a classroom, in a company, or in a country. We all begin to be more of the same when it comes to our violence, when it comes to the direction of our desire. When our desire is horizontal, so to speak, when we're looking to our right and our left for our models. I think there's a difference between horizontal desire and vertical desire, but we probably don't have time to get into that in this episode. So when desire,
why don't you give a
horizontal,
quick summary at least? Do it quickly, and then we can always have you back.
Sure. And this is one of the whole second half of my book is about, is there such a thing as positive mimesis, and is there a way to escape this cycle, and how do we do it? How do we transform our desire? Mm-hmm. Vertical desire would be desiring something greater than the paradigm in which we're in. So take the transcendentals, for instance, truth, beauty, goodness, unity, these things. The imitation of Christ. It's taking something as an external model that can help to pull and draw us out of the whatever mimetic entanglement we might find ourselves in. There's a lot of different ways that great leaders can help people stop thinking about their petty rivalries and focus their attention on some shared transcendental that's not scarce. I mean, everybody can share in beauty. So that's one minor example of that. But I want to finish the sort of how the scapegoating mechanism works. When it's horizontal, when it's the Hobbesian war of all against all, everybody's the same. They're looking for something to draw them out of this. They're looking for somebody who's different. And a scapegoat usually emerges. Girard says somebody who in some way is on the outside or is distinguished from the rest of the group. Now, very often it's somebody that just is different enough where they resisted the mimetic contagion. I mean, they might be the one who's probably the most innocent of everybody, but the innocence or the guilt of the person that they sort of, one person turns their collective attention to the scapegoat, and then mimetically, they all begin to look and accuse this person as being the cause of all their problems because the person seems to be an outsider, somebody who inflicted their problems on them from the outside, not realizing that they created the violence and the tension themselves. So it's kind of like if you think about the way that we refer to a financial crisis, we refer to a lot of things that we sort of do ourselves by using words like, there was a tsunami or an avalanche of debt, or, we talk about some of the things that we inflict on ourselves as being natural disasters, because that way it's something from the outside came that we had no part in and messed everything up. And a scapegoat is similar to that. Scapegoat is somebody who's an outsider who is the cause of our problems. And the group mimetically so there's a contagion of accusation that happens. I point to somebody and say, hey, he looks guilty. And once the first person has cast that stone or pointed that finger, then it's all the easier for the second person to follow, and it's easier for the third person to do that. And the fourth and the fifth, it's almost effortless.
Because
to join in.
Right, because that's the second stage of mimesis, right? So the first stage is just kind of copying one another. Then the rivalry breaks out. In order to break out of the rivalry, there's two possible things in a sense. One is, and we've talked about this, positive mimesis, where maybe, as you said, you're called to something higher and you break out. But often what happens is negative mimesis, that is scapegoating. So they blame one person or one group that looks different. And then the second type of mimesis takes place. Everybody's imitating that. And now, next thing you know, you've got a mob against an individual or a group, right?
Exactly. And you can think of it as everybody turning and facing everybody else before the scapegoat. So they're turned inward. And after somebody spots the scapegoat and the mimetic accusations pile up, they sort of turn from facing each other, and they can stand shoulder to shoulder, all looking at the same cause of their problems. So in a sense, it unites them. That's the irony, is that the scapegoat unites people who were warring and in conflict and, in threat of destroying one another from within. All of a sudden, they're united in a shared hatred and accusation of an other. And they can, it used to be that this person would just be stoned or they would be hung, the witch trials. They would quite literally kill the scapegoat. And this goes back to Judaism with the actual scapegoat ritual. That's why we call this the scapegoat, because that was a way for them to expiate their sins by transferring their own guilt onto a literal goat and driving them out into the desert. So that's what people do. And it used to be through violence. Today, it happens much more with, it could be a character assassination in the media. We don't often actually violently kill people, but we can certainly destroy their reputation. We can expel them from a community. There's kind of the cancel culture is all about scapegoating. So we do it in very different ways today, but it's the same mechanism at work.
Right. And of course, we see, and Girard writes about this, both in the medieval period and of course in the modern period, the Jews are often scapegoated, right? I mean, there's deep-seated anti-Semitism that blames the Jews for our own problems. And there's a great, excellent essay where he kind of develops that out. Let me actually give you a little quote here that, or at least partial. I'll summarize a bit. This is from his book, The Scapegoat. It's actually in chapter 2 called Stereotypes of Persecution. And he's saying that you get this kind of negative reciprocity, right? It brings people into opposition with each other, and it tends to make their conduct uniform and is responsible for the predominance of the same. This is what you were talking about. Thus, paradoxically, it's both conflictual and solipsistic. So it both makes you kind of by yourself, and it's also conflictual. The lack of differentiation corresponds to the reality of human relations, yet it remains mythic. He says, in our own time, we've had a similar experience, which has become absolute because it's been projected on the entire universe, right? We kind of blame the world, right? And so he quotes actually very interesting from a Portuguese monk, Quo de Santa Maria, and from 1697. And he says that you get this kind of radical breakdown of society. Laws are no longer obeyed, businesses come to a halt, families lose coherence, streets lose their lively atmosphere, everything's reduced to confusion, right? And then there's no pity shown to friends, since every sign of pity is dangerous. All the laws of love and nature are drowned or forgotten in the midst of horrors of such great confusion. Children are suddenly separated from their parents, wives from their husbands, brothers and friends from each other. Men lose their natural courage and, not knowing any longer what advice to follow, act like desperate blind men who encounter fear and contradictions at every step. Okay, that's this monk from 1647, right? Quo de Santa Maria. And now Girard's pointing out, well, this is exactly, think about, say, for example, German National Socialism and the sense participation of ordinary men, as the book's called, in actually persecuting an innocent people, right? The Jewish people. Think about the type of crazy revolutionary activity where people do things that they thought would be absolutely impossible for them. But the contagion comes and they're doing these horrific things. Another thing that Girard points out that I think is very interesting in this same chapter, he says, men feel powerless when confronted with the eclipse of culture. They are disconcerted by the immensity of a disaster, but they never look into the natural causes. The concept that they might affect those causes by learning more about them remains embryonic, right? And he says, rather than blame themselves, people inevitably blame either society as a whole, which costs them nothing, or people who seem particularly harmful for easily identifiable reasons. And the suspects are accused of a particular category of crimes. And I think this part here, which I'm about to read. Maybe this is a little bit too much reading, but you should get the book it's really good. Chapter 2, page 14 and 15. But I think this aligns with the ideas of ressentiment, of Tocqueville, and of kind of revolution. And I think this is one of the reasons why Girard's important. He says, certain accusations are so characteristic of collective persecution that their very mention makes modern observers suspect violence in the air. They look everywhere for other likely indications, other stereotypes of persecution to confirm their suspicion. At first sight, the accusations seem diverse and their unity is easy to find, right? First, there are violent crimes, which choose as an object those people whom it is most criminal to attack. And this is really important, right, Luke? Because I want you to comment on this. There are violent crimes, and it chooses their object those people who it's most criminal to attack, either in the absolute sense, right, or in reference to the individual committing the act. So a king, a father, the symbol of supreme authority, right? And in biblical and modern societies, we kill the weakest and most defenseless, especially young children. Then there are sexual crimes, rape, incest, bestiality. The ones most frequently invoked transgress the taboos that are considered the strictest in the society in question. And finally, there are religious crimes such as the profanation of the host. And here too, it's the strictest taboos that are transgressed. So all these crimes seem to be fundamental because they attack the foundational cultural and social order. So you don't just need to loosen the social bond. He says it must be totally destroyed. And I think if we begin to look, say, at modern society, this is one of the reasons why Girard is such an interesting person, is because as he describes this, that's a lot of what we see in our culture. We don't simply see, look, we've got problems, we got to fix them. We actually see this, a type of transgression against the innocent, the weakest, just like we saw, for example, in the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the German National Socialism, like this transgression of taboos that actually breaks down our humanity. How would you comment on that? Help me and our listeners understand this kind of Girardian argument of the scapegoat.
Yeah, well, you said a lot, so there's a couple of things in particular that I want to comment on. So first of all, we can see this with political correctness, right? People need to speak a certain way, and certain ways of speaking have become taboo, and those that transgress them quickly become victims. But I think we need to be very, very careful about talking about scapegoats as only being innocent. Girard is very, very clear on this point, that a scapegoat can be innocent or guilty. It doesn't matter. The point is that the scapegoat is used in a way, regardless of guilt or innocence, to transfer guilt onto the scapegoat, and it results in what Aristotle would call some form of catharsis, some form of miraculous kind of healing. So I'll say something a bit controversial here, because I don't want the listeners to think that scapegoats are always innocent. I would say that perhaps Elizabeth Holmes may be used as a scapegoat. She used as a scapegoat is the key word. Because you'll notice something, I think that Elizabeth Holmes, who's the former founder of Theranos, a company that has been found to have defrauded investors, hasn't went to trial yet. We're about 9 months away from her going to trial. I think personally that she is guilty of fraud, but it doesn't mean that if she's guilty that we still can't use her as a scapegoat. And one hint that we might be doing that is if you look at the documentary, you watch the whole documentary about the downfall of a company, not a single person in that there's not a single voice of dissent, not a single person takes any responsibility for the 10 years that they were raising money and operating. She single-handedly seems to be responsible for everything that happened. Everybody that was involved in that company for 10 years, Elizabeth Holmes was responsible for all of the problems. It's just a sign of a scapegoating mechanism at work, because it's unanimous. It's all against one. It's everybody saying the same thing, that this one person is solely the one responsible for our problems. And that can bring about some form of a transferal onto somebody. What about everybody else? There are hundreds of people that she worked with that sort of, were involved with that company. So I'm not saying that so I think it's important to differentiate that.
So like maybe another example that's contemporary example would be Jeffrey Epstein, right? So he's surrounded by all these scientists and funding them and all these other things. And a lot of materialists who are basically Jeffrey Epstein in one sense, and I'm careful, I'm not blaming the scientists for this, although, I do think Girard has actually a very interesting line says about Nietzsche. He says, for Nietzsche, there are more than just philosophers in the world. There are madmen who take people at their word. And if you take a lot of the materialist scientists, essentially hedonism, and you're a radical materialist hedonist looking to extend pleasure in your life and transhumanism and all the stuff that Jeffrey Epstein was supporting and buying into, he's kind of the result of these ideas. Ideas do indeed have consequences, and Jeffrey Epstein is the result. Yes, he's a free person. He made his own decisions. But nevertheless, these ideas are out there. And so everybody says, he's just kind of an aberration. Well, he's an aberration, but only he's maybe one of the few people who took it to its logical conclusion, right? And so I think there's also it's solely him. Well, actually, there's a whole culture of disorder that is part of that. And if you unanimously only single him out, then you actually don't fully address the deeper disorder underlying it. Do you think that's, I think that's right, but how would Girard respond to that?
I think that's accurate. And look, in terms of the victims that we choose for our scapegoats, anybody can become powerless and a scapegoat when it's all against one. I don't care if you're the president of a country, if you're a billionaire, nobody's very powerful against a mob when it's all against one. When it's unanimity against you, basically. That's how scapegoats get made. And it's critical to understand that in order for the scapegoat mechanism to work, we cannot know that we're doing it. I have to be absolutely convinced, and so do you, in the scapegoat's guilt. If I'm not convinced of the scapegoat's guilt, it doesn't work. You can think of it almost like a technology. That's a bug in the system. If the guilt is not unanimous, the scapegoating mechanism doesn't work. So we have a real problem in our society, because Girard would say that, the crucifixion revealed the scapegoat mechanism. So now we're sort of all aware that scapegoating is something that happens, that, victims often are completely innocent. And we're very, very good at pointing out scapegoats and pointing out victims, and we see them everywhere. We're sort of experts at this, like victimology. We've all become experts in seeing who the victims are and all of the different scapegoats that are happening in the world. I mean, the media makes scapegoats. They practically live on scapegoats. The problem with that is that as we're busy pointing them out everywhere else, we're probably more likely than ever to be creating more victims ourselves, and to not realize that, the scapegoat mechanism is not something out there. And same with mimetic desire. It's not something out there. It's something that's actually like at work within the fabric of the social sort of structures that we live in. And this focus on finding them all and pointing out all of the victims all the time, we're sort of really, really in a temptation to not see the ones that we ourselves are making.
Okay, so two quick points. So in one sense, both you and it seems I depart from Girard a bit, because Girard seems to almost always imply that the scapegoat is innocent. But you're saying, which I think is right, that we also scapegoat guilty people. But the problem is, say, Epstein, okay, for example. I mean, for all we know, there wasn't a trial, but right, for all we know, all those things that he did, or what's her name, Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos. Again, we don't know that, but let's say they're guilty. The problem with scapegoating them is not that they're guilty, it's that by unanimously singling out that person as the fundamental source of the problem, we actually miss the deeper sources of disorder and we don't really solve them. That's one thing. But the second thing is that by victimizing everybody all the time, we actually end up kind of masking the fact that we are scapegoating oftentimes innocent people. Is that Girard's point that you're trying to get out?
I think so. And Girard is very, very clear that scapegoats, it doesn't matter if they're guilty or innocent. But most Girardian scholars do seem to focus on the innocence of the victim more so than sort of the neutrality of the victim.
Right. So that's a little bit of a departure from Girard. But I think that yes, because, and he's actually making, as we talk about the Greg Thornberry podcast, that oftentimes the scapegoat is innocent, right? But the same mechanism happens, right? Because the scapegoat is the same mechanism and the same effect, which is it distracts us from seeing ourselves. So this is a very interesting point. In fact, I think I talked about this with Greg, but it's worth repeating again. When Girard is analyzing in an essay Jesus' critique of the Pharisees, he says the Pharisees had the highest religious practice known to man, right? So he's not saying that they're just bad, right? But he says the Pharisees, your ancestors killed the prophets. And you blame your ancestors instead of saying, yeah, we would have done it too. And by your blaming your ancestors, i.e. scapegoating your ancestors, you prove that you're going to kill me. And I think this is a super important point, because this is what we, Catholics have done. Both of you and I are Catholic. And Catholics have scapegoated the Jews for killing Jesus. Well, every time, if we scapegoat the Jews for killing Jesus, it's just proof that we would have been there doing it. Because the point is, the scapegoat, in a sense, blocks us from our own guilt. And I think that's why scapegoating, that's, I think, one of the really important revelatory aspects of Girard's concept of the scapegoat, that notice our own scapegoating, that we're scapegoating others. And when we scapegoat others, it means we're probably creating victims, we're doing negative things and harmful things.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you build monuments to the prophets that your ancestors killed. And as you build this monument and, decry the acts of your ancestors, you're about to kill me too. And I think we can see that playing out in our society today. I mean, we look back at history and we see all kinds of problems throughout, American history and world history, and we're very, very good at calling them out. But as we're doing that, what new victims are we creating? And this is why Girard is so important. I mean, he's warning us about this, and he says that if we don't realize that we're doing this, he uses sort of very apocalyptic language, and he says we're simply going to continue to fuel a mimetic crisis for which we now have no solution, because the scapegoating mechanism is out. It's been revealed. It's sort of been unmasked. So it doesn't work the way that it used to work when it could instantly restore peace to a community. It doesn't have the same sort of effectiveness as a tool. The only way out, it's sort of a binary choice that we have now, that sort of Christianity has made the world choose between honestly love and really like entering into the world of another and loving them as a person, and not using them as an object, in the worst form as a scapegoat that we victimize. We really have a choice to make now, because scapegoating is no longer an option on the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that needs a little bit of unpacking. I've read enough Girard to follow you, but I think that needs unpacking. But I think the thing that's relevant, because we need to wrap up here, I think Solzhenitsyn also is very important in this. There's an overlap there with the importance of truth telling, and that he was worried about the deep deceit that was so part of Russian and then Soviet society that it actually created the conditions for real breakdown. And I think this is another overlap with scapegoating. Unless we're honest with the fact that we would have done the same thing. I sometimes say we'll talk about the Nazis killed the Jews, right? Or the revolutionaries did this, or the Russian Revolution did that. But I would have stood up for them. Well, I can't even tell the truth, at work sometimes, or I can't tell the truth, at the social group in which I'm involved, right? Why do we think, after habitually not telling the truth and being afraid and blaming other people, that when we would actually have to stand up, that we would be able to do it? And I think there's an overlap between Solzhenitsyn's commitment to the truth, right, and then loving another person, as you brought out, and Girard's warning about the nature of scapegoating. So let me wrap up by asking you a couple of quick questions. So this has been, I appreciate your time, Luke. It's good to talk to you, and good luck on finishing that book. Let me ask you a question. My real question, I guess, is why, and we've talked a little bit about it at the end, so you've started to answer it, but why is Girard important? So let me make a little obnoxious case here of contagion. Peter Thiel is a billionaire investor, and he wrote a book, 0 to 1, on entrepreneurship. People like Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel was a student of Girard at Stanford. And Peter Thiel's a big fan of Girard. And so maybe the case that, Peter Thiel liked Girard, it's cool to like Girard, I'll follow a little bit of contagion, and we're reading this person. Is that a problem? Or is there really something more, that Girard actually really is important and he really matters? What do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. I think Peter Thiel would say that there's a funny thing with people that are attracted to Girard's thought. And it may be that some of the people that are most attracted to Girard's thought are the ones that are most mimetic themselves. So they see in Girard's thought something that they recognize in themselves. And of course, there could be some kind of a circular thing where, Peter Thiel is my mimetic model. I think he's, super smart, and he thinks Girard's super important. So he must be super important.
But that happened, by the way, in defense of Peter Thiel and Girard. I think that happens all the time, right, Luke? I think, for example, if somebody talks about a book that they've read and they're talking about the book, I have immediate mimetic desire. I got to get that book. I got to be in the know, right? So this doesn't just apply to Girard, for sure. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out as the critique. But why do you think he matters?
I'll give you an interesting anecdote, and I bet it matters who tells you about a book too. Not everybody's sort of judgment score is probably equal in your world. So Peter Thiel said something interesting, I think, that cuts to the heart of that. I asked Peter personally why in 0 to 1, which is a very, very Girardian book, why he never specifically mentions Girard. And it's actually for this very reason. He said, because I wanted the thoughts in the book to stand on their own. And I wanted people to sort of see patterns and things that are happening out in the world without getting the feeling that I'm sort of dogmatically following some thinker or something like that. To the extent that what Girard has said is true, and that this is the way that desire works, It's less about Girard. I mean, he sort of is very in the spirit of Girard. He wanted to deflect attention away from himself and to the ideas themselves. To the extent this is explanatory in the world, I would say to the extent that any philosophy is true, and we see it, I think there's a phenomenology of this in the world that we can see. I would just challenge the listeners. It's not about Girard. It's actually why I prefer not to make it Girard, Girard, Girard all the time. Let's actually take this now. Girard died 4 or 5 years ago. It's time to take his thought and really rigorously examine the world and grapple with whether what he said is coming to bear. And it seems that some of the predictions that he made, for instance, about social media sort of flattening the world and leading to more internal mediation and more conflict, seem to be playing out. So I would say he's important because I think his insights are true. Mm-hmm. And he's warning us about the consequences of not being aware, not having the humility to see the influences on our own desire. This whole thing, everything that we've been talking about, starts with the way that my desires are born and take shape. And I think we need to start there because the ripple effect happens, but it happens in subtle ways that we're usually not aware of until after the fact, until something's already happened, until we're already in a mimetic crisis, until a scapegoat has already been made. By then, it's too late. I think we can start with an examination of conscience and a look at how this operates in my family, in my workplace, in my school, in my town, and find it there. And then we can extrapolate from there and see the way that this works in the broader culture.
No, that's good. I think that's right. I mean, in some sense, I think Girard's important because if he's phenomenologically analyzing something that's true, he helps lead to self-understanding and also to understanding of the cultural and social world we're in and all the things that you just laid out. So, Luke, thanks for your time. Thanks for taking time to come onto the podcast and to walk through this with us. Good luck on the rest of your book. Tell listeners where can we find your work and how to pre-order that book so they can buy it when it comes out.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Michael. It's a pleasure thanks for grappling with me and helping me work out some thoughts too while we're at it. You can find the book at lukeburgis.com, February of 2021. But if you go to my website, sign up for notices, and I'll drop you an email when it comes out.
Great. Luke, thank you very much. And really appreciate your walking through this and hope to have you back on the show.
Really appreciate it, Michael. Thanks again.
Thank you.